So trying again, talking about brown fat. We didn't know until very recently. So this book was printed in 2018. I don't know when the research came out, but I do know that a book that I used that's like 7 years older doesn't have information about this in the book. So this is a recent development. We're talking the last 5 to 10 years, realizing that there's brown fat in humans too. It's not just animals. And there's brown fat specifically in adults too. It's not just babies. So the regular fat is normally white or yellow, and it doesn't do a whole lot. So its metabolism rate is really low, which means it's not taking energy and using it. It just kind of exists. Brown fat, on the other hand, has a lot of energy, so it has a high metabolism, which means it burns a lot of energy. And the reason that brown fat works the way that it does, rather than making ATP, it actually has mitochondria that are structurally different. So remember the idea of structure and function go together? Okay, when you look at this being oxidative phosphorylation, this structure, the ATP synthase, allows the concentration gradient, so high concentration to low concentration of hydrogen ions, to flow through back into the matrix so that that production, that flow, makes ATP. In brown fat, there's either no ATP synthase or far fewer ATP synthase molecules, and instead there are channels which are just literally like open doors that allow the hydrogen ions to come back in. So the cell goes through, and these mitochondria go through all the steps of cellular respiration, except when it comes to making the ATP here, they don't make nearly as many ATP because they're just allowing the hydrogen ions to flow back through. So that means that there's a lot of heat generated, but not a lot of energy generated. So brown fat helps produce heat, helps keep the body warm because it burns energy, but it doesn't make ATP from that, or it doesn't make as much ATP. So this section talked about a ton of different studies that have been done. The discovery of this was accidental though. Scientists looked at PET scans, PET scans, from cancer patients and saw some things that didn't make sense. So there were some results on the scan that they hadn't seen before or hadn't noticed, so they seemed a little bit off. Then they took PET scans and compared them to CT scans, which are sometimes called CAT scans, and they found that there were sections of places in the neck and some other parts of the body that had brown fat, or looked like they had brown fat. So then they did some other studies and have done more research, and they found a couple of things. One, that cold helps stimulate brown fat to be active. So you could have brown fat and not be using it. But if you go outside for a couple of hours because you're sledding or playing with cousins or you're going to go skiing, that could activate your brown fat. So being exposed to cold helps activate it and turn it on. They also found that when you look at different types of people, so if you look at the body mass index, someone who is obese has brown fat that's activated less and turned on less than someone who's lean. So when they looked at the individuals in the study, most of the people who had a low BMI had a lot of active brown fat after they were exposed to cold. People who had a high BMI had some brown fat, it was turned on, but it wasn't as active. Okay, so they're looking at, okay, if we can turn on brown fat, can we help people lose weight? If we can turn on brown fat, can we help people who are thin stay thin? What's that look like? How does that work? So there's a ton of research being done. You could probably go online and find information about a lab doing research about this right now. So this is a new development. Okay.
I've seen, a bunch of commercials and stuff where people they're trying to lose weight, but they go to this doctors. It's not but they freeze you, or they freeze they have a whole thing. It looks like when you're getting a ultrasound, and they put it on your.
And
stomach.
they put a cold thing
Yeah.
in places
So
where your fat is. Great question. I don't know. So if we're looking, let's see, where is it? I can read it through here. They found brown fat in the neck and chest area. So I don't know if we found brown fat in other places, but if it's only in the neck and the chest, then if you're trying to have the cold stimulate brown fat here, if there's no brown fat here, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and if there's no brown fat there, and then they know that, or they just, because a lot of people don't know about brown fat, so are they doing that to make it seem like it's going to help you lose weight in your stomach, but it's really, they're not actually doing anything to your stomach.
Maybe. But another thing, so we've talked about two types of fat. underneath where this sticky note is they actually say, hey, there's a third type. Like, since learning about brown fat and realizing that that's in humans, we've discovered a third type. It's called beige. So beige is kind of in between brown, which is a darker color, and white, which would be a lighter color. So your white fat can actually become beige fat, which means it can make more mitochondria and then have a higher metabolism level. So maybe the point is, let's make white fat into beige fat so that people can burn more energy. I have no idea. And realistically, like, I don't even know if the things, when people do stuff like that, if they're studied enough and well tested enough to make a difference. That's part of the problem with dieting pills. Most of the time, the FDA, which is the organization that helps us figure out what types of things are ethical and if they work well or not, they don't usually approve or go through any testing for things like diet pills. So you kind of take those at your own risk. And what works for one person might not work for other people. Okay. This section in 611 pretty much is a review of the whole process of cellular respiration. So the bell work that we just answered pretty much talks about what's in this figure. So you should know this figure overall. So there's the 3 different steps. The first 2 use substrate level phosphorylation. The last one uses oxidative phosphorylation. You should know that. Because you should know the overall results of each step as well, you should know that glycolysis makes pyruvate. It also produces NADH. Okay? In pyruvate oxidation, we get acetyl-CoA, which goes into the citric acid cycle, and we get some NADH. From the citric acid cycle, we get more NADH, and we get FADH too. And then these molecules, as electron carriers, are all used in oxidative phosphorylation. So you should know kind of those things in general. But there's really no new information in this section. Okay? In general, we talked about the fact that there's a range for cellular respiration as far as how much ATP is made. There's a couple of reasons for that, and that is probably the only new thing it's described right here. But ATP generation can vary because, bless you, the NADH that's made outside of the mitochondria passes off electrons through the membrane, but it passes it either to another NAD plus, so that becomes NADH, or it passes it to an FAD. And because FAD is not used early on in the 3rd step, so if we go back to here, NADH is dropped off here, FAD is dropped off farther down the chain. So if the electrons are passed to FAD, then they're less effective and you get less energy transmitted from them. So you're not going to get as much ATP if it's made and if the electrons are added to FAD. So that's one reason why ATP can vary. The other is that concentration gradient, so lots of hydrogen ions in the inner membrane space and fewer in the matrix, that difference in concentration is not just used for cellular respiration. It's used to do other things in the cell. So because it's also used for other things and not all of the energy goes to making ATP, the amount of ATP made can vary. Okay? So those are a couple of reasons why we get a range instead of a specific set number. Fermentation. Y'all probably are familiar with some of the products of fermentation because you know people who use them or you've eaten them yourself, some of them. So fermentation is literally making ATP without using oxygen. So it's harvesting energy without using oxygen. So there's 2 different types of cellular respiration in general. There's aerobic versus anaerobic. Which one needs oxygen? Aerobic. So anaerobic respiration is some type of fermentation. There's 2 general types of fermentation. With both of them, glycolysis takes place first. So glycolysis just happens outside the mitochondria like normal. But then the fermentation allows the NADH that's made to become NAD plus without using oxygen. The NAD plus has to be recycled so glycolysis can keep occurring, because otherwise the cell would run out of NAD plus. Okay, so the 2 types are lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation. Okay, and they look like this. So this is lactic acid fermentation, and in the first one, pyruvate becomes lactate. Okay, it becomes lactic acid. Some teachers and still some books will talk about the fact that lactic acid is what makes you sore after a workout, but we don't really think that's true anymore. Research shows that when lactic acid is made, within an hour of working out, of producing lactic acid, the lactic acid goes to the liver, and is made back into pyruvate. So really, there's not lactic acid sitting around in your body for a few days making your muscles sore. You're probably sore because you've stressed the muscles and maybe broken the muscles. So the muscle fibers literally have to repair themselves and regrow. That's probably why you're sore. Lactic acid fermentation is used to make cheese and yogurt. So you've probably eaten those. So you've eaten the result of fermentation. And other types of fermentation are used to make sauerkraut and a couple of other things. Alcohol fermentation is well known because it helps make alcohol. So that's when pyruvate gives off carbon dioxide and becomes ethanol, which is a specific type of alcohol. So if you take chemistry in college, there's a good chance you might do a lab where you're performing fermentation and you'll use yeast to make ethanol. So then the lab aide or the teacher, depending on how big of a lab group you have, will add some stuff to the ethanol so that nobody tries to drink it because it is alcohol. Yes, you could get drunk from it if you drank it. So that what they add is something that tastes bad and is also toxic to your body, more so than just the ethanol, so that people don't drink that product from lab, which I just think is kind of funny. So the reasons that we use this is for brewing or for baking, and we also use it, low battery. We also use it for making wine. The ethanol that's made, though, is actually toxic to the organisms that make it. So when we bake bread, the yeast performs fermentation and the alcohol evaporates off. So the yeast can stay alive longer when we're making bread than if we make wine or beer. So if we brew with alcohol fermentation, once the alcohol levels get to like 14%, everything dies. So I thought that's a kind of interesting. But both of these are used to make different kinds of food. Okay. When we're talking about things that can perform anaerobic respiration, they're called anaerobes, and there's two different general types. If they're obligate anaerobes, they have to perform anaerobic respiration. So when they're with oxygen, they die. Oxygen is actually poisonous for them. So these exist really deep in the earth or very far underwater. They're in places where there is usually no oxygen, so they're not exposed to that. So in the presence of oxygen, they die. A facultative anaerobe is something that can either make ATP with or without oxygen, so it can do both. Yeast is a good example of that. And our muscle cells are actually an example of that too, because our muscle cells can perform aerobic respiration or they can perform lactic acid fermentation. So our muscle cells can do both. So pyruvate acts as a fork in the road. Either there's oxygen, so then the cells and the organisms use oxidative phosphorylation, or there's no oxygen, so then they use fermentation. Okay, those are kind of your two options. Last little bit, this section talks about the fact that glycolysis has been around a really long time. So organisms that are not eukaryotic and that are prokaryotic still perform glycolysis. Because of that, we assume glycolysis has been around for longer than cellular respiration as a whole, because it's a simpler process in and of itself. Okay. This section restates the fact that carbs and fats and proteins can all be burned in cellular respiration. It is easier for your body to use carbs because those can be broken straight down into sugar. For fats, your body has to first convert it into glycerol fatty acids, then it has to convert it into a couple of other things to use it. And proteins are the type of macromolecule your body is least likely to use because it has to do a lot of conversion. So proteins usually are broken into the amino acids and then used to make more protein. They're not usually used in cellular respiration, but they can be. In this section, pretty much it looks at the relationship between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So things that perform photosynthesis can make their own organic molecules. We can't. So in order to get organic molecules for cellular respiration, we have to eat something. And it comes back to the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Either we make our own food or we don't. Biosynthesis is the process of making something that's organic. And the reason I'm taking any time talking about this section is you should know that the pathways for making molecules actually are turned off kind of based on supply and demand. So if you have a lot of ATP, this is one of the best examples, your body shuts off the process for making ATP. So way back in glycolysis, the first step of cellular respiration, the body shuts off glycolysis until your ATP levels are low, which means your ADP levels are high, and the presence of a lot of ADP turns that pathway back on. So your body literally regulates itself based on what it has versus what it doesn't have. It's called feedback inhibition, or it's a negative feedback loop. It's another way to talk about it. Any questions?